Warren Buffett just issued his final warning to investors. For decades, he has been the biggest bull on America. He built a $2.4 trillion empire all off of a $112 paycheck he made at age 11. But now, at about 95 years old, he is raising serious red flags about the future of the US economy and the dollar, the foundation of his entire fortune. I found this really interesting video where he breaks all this down, and I want to go through it together with you, because the craziest part is that he might actually be making an argument for an asset he has spent the last 15 years fighting against. Let's dive into it. Okay, so the context here is that this is Warren Buffett's final Berkshire Hathaway shareholder meeting with him as the acting CEO. He's stepping down effectively this year out of the game at 94 years old. And he was asked this question about the Japanese yen in one of the positions that he was holding. But then he goes on this really interesting tangent about the US dollar, which you got to take a look at.
Obviously, we wouldn't want to be owning anything that we thought was in a currency that was really going to hell. And that's the big thing we worry about with the United States currency. I mean, the tendency of a government to want to debase its currency over time there's no system that beats that. You can pick dictators, you can pick representatives, you can do anything. But the people, there will be a push toward weaker currencies, and of course,
so one of the points here that he makes that's really interesting is it doesn't really matter who you put in charge of the creation of money, whether it is a dictator who can just, create it from a button on his desk, or a central bank where you have a whole bunch of people charading around, economists making monetary policy and creating tools to do it. You get the same result over a long enough period of time, which is that you have a massive excess of money printing, which outweighs the value of the new, economic value created within the economy. Henceforth, you get inflation. A little history lesson here, and he goes into this too, is that for the longest time before we had central banks, because the power was so centralized with dictators or powerful presidents or rulers of countries, you had very blatant versions of this inflation, coin clipping being one of them. I don't know if you've ever checked this out. I know some of you guys are super familiar with this, but if you ever check out a coin, generally it has these little perforated edges on it. And the reason for that is that back in the Roman times, people would pay for silver coins. They would end up going back to the treasury of the government, and then they would clip the edges of them and make them just slightly smaller, but they would still retain kind of the face value. And that little, 5-10% of silver trimmings would go back into, the treasury of the dictator, and they would create more coins out of that, effectively diluting the supply. And so eventually they just said, well, we have to have these perforated, universal edges so that you can't do that. It's going to be very obvious if someone clips a coin, versus back then when they were doing it stealthily.
I mentioned very briefly in the annual report that fiscal policy is what scares me in the United States, because it's made the way it is, and all the motivations are to doing a lot of things that can cause trouble with money. But that's not limited to the United States. It's all over the world. And
so what he's essentially saying is that the fiscal policy path that the US and other countries on is essentially completely unsustainable. The nuance that doesn't really get talked about enough with this is that there is really no path backwards on these things. And what I mean is that certain guarantees and policies are put into place, whether it's Social Security, whether it's universal health care, that nobody will ever in their right mind vote away. You see, obviously, like any discussion of social insurance or Social Security in the United States being taken away, it's immediate no-go. You have no chance of winning an election that way. But when you actually look at US federal spending outlays, you see Social Security, Medicare, health, national defense. These are items that you can't meaningfully reduce how much you spend on. So if you have to spend more and more and more on these things every single year, which you do, and your economy isn't necessarily producing more value, the only way to cover the stopgap is to borrow more money. And usually you're not really borrowing more money, you're printing it to cover your outlays. You're borrowing off of the expense of the people. It's crazy to think that if you look at the United States debt, they're basically only able to cover the interest on it. They're almost never paying down the principal amount of debt, the $36 trillion that they've borrowed over the last, 70, 80 years. It's quite phenomenal that now about 10% of every dollar in the US budget is just to pay the minimum interest payment that is to go out to all the other holders of American debt around the world.
As it gets out of control regularly, as they know, they devalue at rates that are breathtaking, and that's continued. I mean, and people can study economics and you can have all kinds of arrangements, but in the end, if you've got people that control the currency, you can issue paper money, and you will, or you can engage in clipping currencies like they used to do centuries ago.
Let's go back, because I love that quote from Warren Buffett. In the end, if you've got people that can control the currency, you can issue paper money. There's a kind of a hard metaphor that I've been looking for to explain this to people outside of, the financial space. Because when you say things like, well, if people can control the money, they'll print it, it just kind of falls on deaf ears. And like the gamer in me almost relates it to cheat codes in video games, or like God mode. I'll give you an example. If you're playing GTA and you enable cheat codes, eventually you just rely on the cheat codes. And the idea of doing any sort of work in game to earn currency when you can just press a button to get it, it devalues that work entirely. And honestly, it kind of strips the fun away from the video games, which is why I think some of the people that run, the money printer are some of the most like nihilistic and sad people there are. The only consequence that people in government face by printing too much money is that they lose the next election. And I think that's one of the reasons why most of them also hedge their bets immediately once they get out of power and they become lobbyists.
There will always be people. It's the nature of their job. I'm not singling them out as particularly evil or anything like that. But natural course of government is to make the currency worth less over time, and that's got important consequences. And it's very hard to build checks and balances into the system to keep that from happening.
Very hard to build checks and balances into the system to keep that from happening. And that's why it's taken humanity as long as it has to arrive at something like Bitcoin. But it's so interesting that Buffett himself has been fighting Bitcoin for such a long time. He's called it rat poison squared. His main argument for not getting behind Bitcoin or something like gold is that it doesn't produce cash flow. It's not a productive asset. And now, as Buffett is, kind of coming to the end of his tenure at Berkshire Hathaway, he's being very public about how he thinks that the US dollar can't escape the same fate as every other currency. Bitcoin is aiming to solve. It's aiming to be a money that can last, hundreds of years into the future. Like, we have the ability to uphold the monetary policy and to see what it is with pitch perfect transparency. We know exactly how many Bitcoin are issued every 10 minutes. We're going to know in the year 2140. With Bitcoin, we are the checks and balances. Like, you literally can buy one of these things, put it in your home, and you're running the monetary policy of Bitcoin. You're not outsourcing that to other people when you're mining or when you're running something like a node. So I think for me, I've been watching clips of Warren Buffett for a very long time, and I don't want to disrespect him, but his main contention with Bitcoin is that it's not a productive asset.
What is it about Bitcoin that gets you guys so fired up?
Well, when you buy a farm, you look at the crop every year and what prices are, and you decide whether it was a satisfactory investment. I mean, you look to the asset itself and what it produces for you. When we buy a business, we look at what the business earns and decide how we feel about it in terms of what we paid. But we are buying something that at the end of the period, we not only have what we bought in the first place, but we have something that the asset produced. And when you buy non-productive assets, all you're counting on is whether the next person is going to pay you more because they're even more excited about another next person coming along. But the asset itself is creating nothing.
What I would like to build off of this point here, and I think the thing that he misses, is that there is no point to productivity if you cannot store it properly. So he uses this metaphor of the farm. I want to buy a farm instead of a piece of gold or Bitcoin because the farm produces things for me, right? It's productive land. I can do things with it. The farm is only valuable because you can store the fruits of the farm, right? You have to have a refrigerator. You have to have a barn. You have to have fences. And those things are not productive assets. The barn is not productive. The barn is a piece of wood. A fridge is something that consumes electricity and stays cold. Maybe that's productive. The fence definitely isn't productive. But if you don't have those things in your farm, then your productive asset is worthless. Your crops and your fruit are going to spoil or rot. And it doesn't matter how many that you grow, you can't maintain the fruits of your labor long enough to actually sell them and utilize any value from them. So a whole bunch of value just disintegrates. The purpose of Bitcoin is not to be a cash flowing asset. The purpose of Bitcoin is to protect the value that you create with your time. That is productivity, in my opinion. You might not agree with that, but if I don't have those two components to my economic output, a way to create value and a way to store value, then it doesn't work, right? There's no point to storing value if I don't have a mechanism to create it, and there's no point in creating value if I have no mechanism to store it. That is the function of Bitcoin. That is the function of what currency should be. That used to be the original premise of why we have money. It was, number one, to have a common medium to exchange with one another so that we could exchange someone's hairdressing skills for someone's fruit. But the other point of money that a lot of people seem to forget is that it's supposed to store value. You're supposed to be able to move it through generations, to give it to people or to move it, 100 days or 200 days, knowing that it will have the same amount of value from one time span to another. And Buffett also makes the argument that, it's only valuable because someone's going to flip it to someone else. You're always looking for the next sucker to buy it, but that's not true either, right? Like a barn protects value, but I didn't buy it with the expectation to flip it to someone else. I bought it with the expectation of preserving the value of the crops that I've made, preserving the value of the work that I've created, right? And whether that needs to be over a 2-year time span, whether that needs to be over a 5-year time span or a 10-year time span, I mean, it is what it is. The thing about Bitcoin that people don't really understand is that unlike a barn, which, gets weathering and other, forms of storing value, which decay over time and aren't as good at storing value, Bitcoin doesn't have that problem. There's no functional dilution in a Bitcoin. One Bitcoin today gives you the same percentage of the entire network that you're going to get 100 years from now, right? You're going to get 1/21 millionth of all the store value of Bitcoin today. And in the year 2125, you're going to get 1/21 millionth of the entire network then as well, if you keep your Bitcoin that long. And then you have all the other perks of Bitcoin, which is that you can transmit that value instantaneously with zero permission. It's recognized all over the world. I don't have a great metaphor. I'm not Michael Saylor, but it's like a barn that never rots, that you can send anywhere in the world, and that you can perpetually use to store things generations when you're not even around. Now, if you tell me that that's not productive, I don't know what to say. If it's not productive, then maybe it's not productivity I want. But to me, that is doing an awful lot of service to protect the value I have and move it into the future or move it to someone else without fear of loss or fear of censorship or fear of decay. But yeah, going back to the original point, look, I think Warren Buffett's known this for a very long time. He's known that the companies that he invests in should produce cash flow so he can buy more companies and newer companies. But there becomes a point where essentially the strategy stops working, and the strategy has stopped working for the last little bit, right? Warren Buffett has record amounts of cash and he's trying to figure out where to deploy it next. His best idea right now is, instead of owning more of the winner stocks like Apple and whatnot that he thinks are overvalued, is to just buy US treasuries. The question I have to ask for people who are invested in Berkshire Hathaway and people who are really big fans of Warren Buffett is, if the point is not to beat gold, if the point is not to beat the S&P 500, what is the point of investing, right? Is it just this moral decision we make to back ideas and back entrepreneurs and hope that they create something and hope that, we're just angel investors? Or is the idea that there has to be a profit incentive behind it that outperforms the base currency? If there's a chance in your mind that the base currency is going to be Bitcoin, you should be making investment decisions that outpace Bitcoin. You should be looking for ideas that are going to outpace Bitcoin. And frankly, when you think under that lens, there's very few options that with certainty makes sense in that regard. Pretty easy to outpace inflation, pretty easy to, well, not so easy to outpace the S&P 500, very hard to outpace gold, extremely hard to outpace Bitcoin. And so the question then becomes, in the end, why not just invest in Bitcoin? Personally, I see a world where so many companies are going to be investing their own profits into Bitcoin that big funds like Berkshire Hathaway are going to realize, man, all the companies that we want to invest in are stacking Bitcoin. Why aren't we stacking Bitcoin? Those companies stacking Bitcoin will watch their performance tied to Bitcoin. Eventually, at some point, you got to ask, do you want to be one of those companies or not? But yeah, I'd love to know what you think about this. I think a lot of people watching this are going to agree that Warren Buffett is so close to understanding Bitcoin and he just hasn't found the solution yet. But who knows? Maybe he will now that he doesn't have to spend so much time worrying about the Berkshire Hathaway day to day. He can just sit back in Omaha, pick up the Bitcoin Standard, and go on the journey that we've all been through. If you disagree with me on some of my points, I'd love to know why and your thoughts down below. I'm going to respond to every single comment, so really appreciate when you guys interact with the videos. But yeah, thanks so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.